So it's good to be back with you guys so quickly. Maybe not for you all, but for me, I'm excited to continue on in the sermon series today. We're going to be talking about the beginnings of righteousness. And today, the topic inside of that is called extravagant generosity. Before we go on to that, though, let's recap a little bit. So the last several weeks, we've been in a sermon series focusing on perhaps the most famous sermon that Jesus ever did, the Sermon on the Mount. And Scott started off really well going through the Beatitudes, talking about who the kingdom of heaven is for, who's going to inherit. And he had Jesus had a way of kind of flipping the flow, saying everybody back then thought it's going to be the good looking, it's going to be the wealthy, it's going to be the strong, it's going to be those people that we look to and say, hey, these guys are awesome. But God said, nah, we're going to go with the meek and the mild and those who are persecuted. And then Scott went on the next week to talk about the salt and the light, who are we supposed to be to the rest of the world as his followers. Evan, a couple weeks ago, picked up on the law, talking about how the Old Testament law isn't abolished with the coming of Christ, but it's fulfilled in him. And then last week, we talked about how that law is fulfilled starting from the inside out, going from our hearts first and then exterior in the motives of why we're doing what we're doing. A couple of things to come. Today we're talking about the beginning of righteousness. How do we begin to get that next step in our lives with Christ? We know who inherits the kingdom of heaven. We know why they inherited it. And now we want to talk about how. What do we specifically have to do to inherit the kingdom and fulfill the promise that God has given us in our lives? Over the next several weeks after that, we're going to talk about a few subjects. Scott and Evan are coming back next week to tell you how to walk that out in different areas. Before we move on today, though, to talking about generosity, there's something we've got to look at, and that is perspective. How many of you guys in here have glasses? Raise your hand. All the awesome people have glasses. If you don't have glasses, you lucky son of a gun. All right, so glasses do this great thing, and in the Old Testament, you hear a lot about people looking out windows. Windows in the Old Testament generally personify your perspective, the lens at which you're looking through the world. And so if you have glasses, you may see something when you take them off that looks kind of like this. Yeah, that's life for me. Sometimes when you're looking at people, that may be good. Sometimes that may be bad when you're trying to do things in life, like driving. It's important to make sure that the perspective that we have is focused in properly. How many of you guys have ever heard the story of the traveling guy? He's going through with his whole family, and he sees a calf on the side of the road being born with a farmer. And his whole family stops out, and they get out of the car. He's like, oh, man, this is crazy. And the farmer's like, yeah. Going through, and the whole process happens. And the guy asks the farmer, he says, I just got one question. He's like, what? He's like, how fast was the little cow running when he ran into the big cow? Take a second to get that one, won't it? It's a little rough right there. All right. Sometimes our perspective and our viewpoint makes us see things as different from the truth. And so as Christians, when we look at the Bible and we start reading into these ways that we can walk out this righteousness, we need to understand and make sure that our perspective, what we're looking at, is honed in properly. We've got to make sure that we're looking to God and what He expects from us, not to other people and what they want from us. So we're going to start off in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, and we're going to read from there. Be careful. How many of you guys have a mom that's a little bit overprotective? I know a whole bunch of y'all that aren't raising your hands. Brock can stand up with both hands in the air, all right? And so if you ever have a mom and she's like, oh, be careful. My mom, when I started fighting, Max is over here crying. I'm sorry, buddy. All right? So when I started fighting, my mom literally, she wouldn't go to the event. She would, sit at home, and I'd get home, and she'd have, tears in her eyes, and she'd be like, oh, my baby, I want you to be careful. And once she found out I'd won, she'd watch the video. And then she'd like threaten to kill the people who had hit me and yada, yada, yada. But she was so overprotective, but I was like, Mom, it's fine. Generally 2 or 3 days later when I had like a cast on my arm, I was like, I should have listened to Mom. But if there was ever anybody to listen to when they said, hey, be careful, we should stop and take notice. This is the point where the audience that was reading this at the time would have said, oh, this guy's important. The teacher, the rabbi, is here. He's teaching the multitudes. He told me to be careful. I need to listen to why. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. Notice it says when, not if. Do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you in heaven. A couple quick notes here before we dive into this first thing. Notice it says your righteousness, not your sister's righteousness, not your spouse's righteousness, not your friend's righteousness. So many times we get caught up, oh man, did you hear what so-and-so did? I'm worried about what everybody else is doing except for myself. God here is saying, don't worry about them. Let's deal with you first. Your righteousness, nobody can give it. Nobody can take it. God commands it, but only you can choose to walk down that path. It is your responsibility to follow this, nobody else's. Your righteousness. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. How many of you guys have heard the term delayed gratification? Not many of us, right? Everybody that is here today, we are lucky enough to live in a world and a time and a place where we don't have to wait long for things. How many of you guys know Main Street Walmart, North Main Street Walmart? It's like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes from here. I live like, I don't throw a football well, and I could probably hit my house throwing a football from Walmart. And so at 3 a.m. in the morning, if I want a bag of chips and some cheese, I can literally jog to Walmart right then and say, hey, I want some stuff. I want to get it right now. Amazon on the 2-day delivery. How many of you guys like live and breathe on Amazon? Don't lie. I see a couple wives hitting their husbands right now. All right, don't lie. Amazon, you got that 2-day shipping on Prime. If it's a day late, we are flipping out like, oh my gosh, the drones are late to drop this off to my house. I need it right now. We live in a culture that glorifies instant gratification. It's not inherently a bad thing, but what Jesus is saying here is that we can either receive an instant reward by our peers or an eternal reward from our Father in heaven. We just have to wait a little bit. You guys ever heard the saying, good things come to those who wait? Sometimes in life, persistence and perseverance and patience matter more than what happens right now, because I know what I'm working towards is more important than what I can gain today. I may take a loss today and for the next couple months in order to get that win down the road that is bigger and better and greater for me and my family and my walk with God. And then it goes on here. So when you give to the needy, just when you give, not if. In the Jewish culture, back in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament as we know it, it was deeply ingrained into their culture and into their religious mindset to make sure they took care of 3 people groups in particular. 1 was the poor, 2 were widows, and 3 were the elderly people. Now, we have a lot of examples how that didn't go well, and it still doesn't go well sometimes today. But the poor, the widows, and the elderly are specifically mentioned several times in the Old Testament, to the point that certain types of farmers, when they would take their harvest, would leave a percentage of their abundance on the side of the road for people who were walking by could pick up the wheat and the grain to take it home and supply for their family. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Quick little thing right here. The word hypocrites, the base word for this, is pronounced upokratai, right? And it basically means actor. Hypocrites in the New Testament was not an inherently bad thing to be. In fact, it was glorified. If I was a hypocrite or an actor, when I would get up on stage, which would be announced by trumpets in the synagogues and on the streets, the base word for street here is place of busy passage. So these crowded thoroughfares, they would go and put these masks on to play different roles. Particularly, females in certain parts of Rome weren't allowed to act. And so if you had a female portion, a guy would put on a mask, and he'd put on a wig, and he would take on the role of that female that he was portraying. And so when it talks here, it's not a bad thing inherently. Like we say, oh, Scott's a hypocrite. Woo! Here they're saying, don't, well, I love you, Scott. Here they're saying, don't put on masks just because of who you're around. Don't put on a show for the people that you want to perform for. The actions that you take, the things you do in fulfilling your walk of righteousness, in fulfilling what God has called you to do, should be done for God because of your desire to please Him, not the praise and the benefit that you're going to get from those people around you. Speaking of which, how many of you guys have ever seen somebody, maybe everybody in here has Facebook, right? In fact, right now in the world, it's like weird if you don't have Facebook. But if you have Facebook, you've probably seen this, like somebody buys a gift for a person, and it's really nice, and there just happens to be a video camera near there, and it just happens to be posted, them giving them gifts, and then it just happens to be boosted for like $90 to the next 10 miles of the area and advertised. So they're like, by the way, I gave so-and-so this check. For like $400, and then it's all this big, huge thing. Sometimes the show that we put on reveals the motives that we have behind the actions we take. And so what God's saying here is, don't give somebody and then post it on Facebook, hashtag big giver, hashtag generous to a fault, hashtag God lives in me. You know what I mean? Like, we want to make sure that when we're doing these things and when we're giving these gifts, when we're taking care of the poor and filling the gaps around us, it's not for that. If that happens, fine. But don't do it for that motivation. But when you give to the needy, once again, when, not if, you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You know, I asked a couple people in research this week for this sermon, why do they think it's important that these things are done? Why did Jesus say specifically so many times, and next week's sermon when it talks about prayer and the week after fasting, there's a big component of it being just in private, just for you, just between you and God. Why do they think that's so important? And almost everyone answered with the same roundabout way. Because what you do in private reveals who you truly are. It is easy to worship God when everybody's in here singing and everybody's got their hands raised and Evan's up here belting out the notes. It's easy. It's easy to take communion when the person next to me hands me the plate and I'm like, oh, I better take it. It's going to be weird. It's easy to walk into church when all your friends are there. It's hard to follow the principles and the morals and the ethics when you're by yourself and nobody's going to see it. It's hard to deal with. Last week, we talked about 5 or 6 topics. Thank you, Scott, by the way, for giving me the subjects nobody wants to preach all on the same day. But we talked about 5 or 6 topics of things that take place between you and God, and how God looks at that and says, you know what, Josh, when you are alone and you do this, that's what I look at. Not when you're in church, not when you're in front of others, because it's easy to be nice to other people then. It's easy to be accepting of other people then, but it's not so easy when you're by yourself and you don't have anybody to impress. We have an addiction to public confirmation. In America, we have bought into the idea that confirmation by others is inference of our popularity, status, holiness, wealth, and a plethora of other things. We base our friends off how many people like our posts. I don't know how many times a week I get a message from somebody that says, a true brother is going to like this post. No, I'm not. I'm going to kick you in the face. Why ask me to do that? It's not the real deal. But we say, man, I only got 32 comments on this photo. I need a new filter. Or I only got 5 people to comment on that Bible verse. Maybe I need some better Jesus hashtags. Or whatever it is, when we do that, we are addicted to that public confirmation. We want the world to think we're important. And we're important because of the likes and the views and the comments that we have. And God says, that is completely wrong. If no one else likes you, if no one else sees you, if no one else loves you, if you are walking with Him in your relationship, that is the one that matters. Everything else is just icing on the cake. Everything else that we get may not inherently be bad, the public recognition. It may not be inherently bad to have a lot of friends on Facebook. It may not be inherently bad to be popular or good looking or smart. But if we're doing that only for recognition by our peers and not using it for the greater in the kingdom of God, then we're making some mistakes. So a couple takeaways. Generosity is the beginning of righteousness. Christ picks this for a reason. I believe that God said, you know what, if I had to tell them the one thing that everybody's going to take away that helps them on their way to righteousness, generosity is this, because it's hard to focus on me when I'm giving to somebody else. It's hard for me to live a self-centered life when I'm worried about the gaps in other people's lives that I can fill. Doesn't make it easy. It doesn't solve all of our issues, but it helps me get into the right mindset. Have you ever tried giving a gift to somebody you absolutely despise? It is difficult, and it will either change your perspective on them or your perspective on your anger, or it won't happen. It's hard. Number 2, proper perspective and motivation are as important as the destination. Just because I'm going towards heaven doesn't mean that's all I need to know. I need to make sure that the lenses that I'm looking through to get there are properly informed and that they're going from the right perspective. I do that by reading my Bible. I do that by talking to God. I do that by making sure I have mentors, people that I can look up to and respect around me, so that when I say, man, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, they can help me get through that next phase. And number 3, like I mentioned last week, by the way, I appreciate you guys bearing with me last week. That was a hard sermon to cover with all those different topics. But all of those traps, all of those things that we talked about, if I am busy doing good for other people, if I am so worried about providing for Kathy's needs and providing for Brock's needs and providing for Max's needs, that it's hard for me to focus on the things that are selfish and self-centered. It doesn't fix the issue, but it gives us some place to start. Application points. Practice what you preach. How many of you guys have heard that? Like 4? Some of y'all need to go to church more. If you've only heard like 5 people heard that, I'll be praying for you guys. All right? Practice what you preach. However, just because the pastor says, or the part-time volunteer unofficial pastor says, hey, you should be nice to other people, doesn't mean you go buy somebody a car. Maybe if you want to, I would take the car. Just saying. Unofficial, unpaid, I'm just saying, you want to buy the car, it's fine. But it might be a good place to start with an oil change or a bag of groceries or maybe a gift card that they can go get gas off of. Filling those needs doesn't necessarily have to be extravagant. Some of us could buy somebody else a car. I know several people in my life that are my friends and family that could buy other people a house if they wanted to. Some of us cannot. It's a sacrifice to get them a tank of gas. Whatever you can do and whatever gaps you can fill do not have to be extravagant. That tank of gas could get them a job that changes their life. That bag of food could feed their kids when nobody else could. So think of the small things you can do, not just the large things that you can do to make an impact on people's lives. Number 2, examine your good deeds and how many people saw you do it. So if I'm going through and I do something awesome for Max and it's between me and Max, and 3 weeks later, everybody knows about what I did for Max, if he told them, that's fine. If I told him, that's not okay because I'm revealing my motivations. If I do something nice for somebody and then I go on to tout about it for the next 3 weeks, first of all, don't be that guy, all right? Second of all, that reveals the motivations that I had in the first place. So make sure, examine who knows about this, who have I told about this, and why? Why did I let them know? Did they have any business knowing that? One of the things, there's a guy, a mentor of mine, that has done just some great things in my life. He's been super generous to me. And he gave me a financial gift one time when I was down and out to start a couple businesses, and I just had to get back on my feet. And I went to him to say thank you. And he was like, Josh, that's nice. I appreciate it, but it's not needed. All right? Furthermore, don't tell anybody about it. Don't mention it to people. He said, honestly, if you can, don't even tell Heidi about why you got that gift. Because I don't want people to know. I don't want people to see it. So I appreciate it, but it's not needed. In our lives, when we give, we should give with the idea that the thanks, that's not needed because we're not doing it for their thanks. We're doing it for a different person's approval. And then number 3, just an idea. This week, maybe you make this a goal once a month, maybe you make it once a day, whatever it wants to be. Go out of your way, be aware of one thing that you can do for someone in your sphere of influence, someone around you that will help them, little tiny thing, but that no one will ever know who completed it. No one will ever know who did it. Just once a week. And see the difference that creates in the lives of the people around you and in your life and your walk with God.